Hundreds of election observers were in Ukraine to help monitor that election campaign. Many of them saw things with their own eyes that called those results into question. One of those people was Liberal MP from Ontario, Borys Wrzesnewskyj. Returned home just last night. He joins me now from Ottawa. Welcome home and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let me ask you first, you helped organize 3 delegations, in fact, of MPs to go watch this process as it continued on. I mean, what was invalidated was just the runoff election. Let me start where I left off with Roman, and that is, given what you saw in those 3 visits, what do you think can be done to make sure that it is a free and fair runoff this time?
Well, Canada played a very important role through the electoral process, and in fact, even the decision that the Supreme Court has concluded with, there was video evidence provided by the Canadian observers and documented evidence which played a very important role in the decision-making of the Supreme Court. Canadians have, and Ukrainian Canadians have, an ability to do things perhaps a little better than your average international observer, knowing the language and understanding the culture. Some of the reports that Canadian observers have provided have been the most detailed and the best documented of this massive fraud that was perpetuated. And there are ongoing discussions at this time. There are preliminary discussions with Elections Canada, with the Prime Minister's office, about Canada's role. Canada has always talked of a special relationship with Ukraine. We've demonstrated it through this electoral process. Our ambassador was the first, prior to the elections taking place, to express publicly reservations of what had been going on. And last week, the unanimous motion in the House spoke to this massive fraud which took place.
But we know that that happened. What have you learned to make sure, or help others make sure that it doesn't happen the next time again?
Well, some of the discussions that are ongoing are to send as many as 1,500 Canadians into Ukraine to act as observers, and perhaps a couple of hundred of Elections Canada technicians on territorial levels, and there's a role to be played at the Central Electoral Commission level. Now, all of this is still very fluid. These are just initial conversations, but it'll have to come together very quickly. There were actually 4 components to the Supreme Court decision, and it was, in fact, better than even some of the optimists expected. The first component, there's especially the 3rd and 4th part to the decision. The first part of it spoke about the second round being so systemically fraudulent that it has to be disqualified and rerun. The second component to the decision said that from this Sunday, in 3 weeks' time, within 3 weeks, the second round has to be rerun. So we have a concrete date. We're looking at December 26th on the outside, when it'll take place. We have a time frame. The third part, which was fascinating, and very few people expected this, because of the nature of the violations, they've said that criminal charges will be pending. And they left it open-ended, so we don't know if they're looking at the poll level, the territorial level, or the Central Electoral Commission level, or in fact criminal charges that will touch on government officials. They've left that open-ended. Now, the fourth point to it is, they said the Central Electoral Commission, having violated the electoral law, should be disbanded. Now, that's very important. They can't force it to be disbanded, and the President is the person that appoints the Central Electoral Commission. But if you tie that back to the third point, which talks about criminal charges, and then in the fourth they talk about the Central Electoral Commission having violated the electoral laws, that's a very strong signal, and it's a signal to the territorial commissions and the poll commissions that, you know, this time round, you better get your act together.
Yeah, and I guess I don't want to get too hung up in technicalities or constitutional stuff here, but just given what you said, if they're going to fire or perhaps even lay charges against those people who were committing fraud last time around, and then you also said there's a pretty short timeline, can they in fact get it together in time to have a free and fair election?
It'll be very difficult, but I do think it's possible, especially when the international community steps forward with the adequate resources, both material and human resources, to get the job done. Like I said, Canada has a key role to play here.
Right.
We have special ties and a special relationship with Ukraine, and will hopefully be at the forefront of some of these projects.
And just a final point, I guess, Roman was talking about this as well earlier when we talked with him, and he was saying that there has to be some kind of a global plan here. We know the European Union is involved with this. Clearly, Vladimir Putin has already said that a runoff election is ridiculous. He does not want this. What's your sense of how those particular components are going to play out in terms of what we will see in Ukraine in the next few weeks?
Well, the Russian government, especially the president, Mr. Putin, has played a very dangerous game throughout this process. And in fact, President Kuchma flying up in a panic to meet with President Putin to get some reinforcement last night, just before the Supreme Court decision, just added to the various threats that supposedly were being applied to the Supreme Court. So this is a rebuke to both President Kuchma and to the Russian president. The international community, it's pretty sad to say that, for instance, France supplied all of 1 observer, Italy supplied 2, Spain supplied 0. There are a number of countries. Canada did supply 40, one of the larger contingents, but obviously nowhere near adequate. And this time we have to get it right. The international community has to get it right for this young democracy that's just in its initial stages of birth.
Well, and certainly we're all conscious of the fact that many of the people in the streets of Kiev have said the West has let us down before. I guess you're arguing that that won't happen this time.
We certainly hope it doesn't, but I have to, your statement, I have to qualify it. I just got back. Canada has established so much goodwill in the streets. As a Canadian member of Parliament, when people realize that in the streets, the hundreds of thank yous that I received, and from key individuals among the Democratic forces, the thank yous that we've received for the motions and for our stand during this process.
Good stuff, and thank you for coming in to talk to us. I'm sure you've had a long, tiring trip, so I'm glad to have you with us.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a break. When Newsworld Today returns.